Before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching this video from. I want to know which city and state you're in. This story is going to affect you in a way you don't expect. Now, let's begin. Grady Memorial Hospital never slept. Its fluorescent lights burned through the night 24 hours a day. 7 days a week, washing long corridors in a pale glow that witnessed the most intimate dramas of the human condition. It was within these white walls, soaked in antiseptic and quiet urgency, that Naomi Pierce spent most of her existence. Not by choice. By necessity, a desperate, grinding necessity that lived inside her and refused to loosen its grip. That Tuesday morning, deep into the early hours before dawn, Naomi dragged her feet along the third-floor corridor. Her white nursing shoes made a soft, muffled sound against the worn linoleum as she moved forward one step at a time. Her brown eyes that once carried the bright confidence of a woman who believed in the future were now framed by deep, dark circles no concealer could truly hide. At 29, she looked closer to 40, as if life had aged her twice as fast. The clock on the wall read 3:47 a.m. when she pushed open the door to room 412. Inside, surrounded by machines that monitored every fragile beat of a failing heart, lay Harold Sterling, an 82-year-old man whose sharp blue eyes still carried a shrewd intelligence that defied the weakness of his body. Tubes and monitors hummed softly around him, a quiet orchestra keeping time with his life. "You should be resting, Mr. Sterling," Naomi said, checking the floor with practiced efficiency. Her movements mechanical yet gentle. "And you should be home, sleeping like someone who still belongs to the living," the old man replied. His voice was hoarse, rough with age, yet warm enough to cut through the sterile cold of the room. "How many hours in a row has it been this time?" 16. "Maybe 18, Naomi answered, forcing a smile that never quite reached her eyes. "You don't need to worry about me." "Yes, I do." Harold extended his wrinkled hand and closed it around her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Sit down. Just for a minute." There was something in his tone that made her obey without argument. Naomi pulled the plastic chair closer and sat beside the bed, her shoulders slumping under a weight no one else could see. The silence that settled between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was familiar. Built over weeks of night shifts, whispered conversations, and the quiet bond that forms when two people face loneliness together. "I know about the debts, Naomi." The words dropped into the room like stones into still water. Naomi felt the blood drain from her face. Her hands began to tremble before she could stop them. How do you? "I was a businessman for 60 years, Harold interrupted gently. "I learned to read people better than I ever read contracts." His eyes studied her with compassion and something else she couldn't quite name. $300,000. Student loans. Your mother's treatment, and that ex-boyfriend who vanished and left you holding the guarantee for his failed business. Tears burned behind Naomi's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Not here, not now. I'm paying it off," she said quickly. "I'm working on it." "Working yourself into the ground," Harold said, shaking his head slowly. 3 hours of sleep a night. Double shifts every day. Hiding in the bathroom to answer calls from creditors. How long do you think you can keep this up before your body gives out? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Because the truth was, Naomi was already collapsing silently, like a building whose foundation had been eaten away without anyone noticing. What would your mother say if she saw you like this? The mention of her mother hit like a knife to the chest. Rose Pierce had lost her battle with cancer 2 years earlier, leaving behind not just grief, but a mountain of medical bills insurance refused to cover. Naomi could still hear her last words as clearly as if they'd been spoken yesterday. "Be happy, my daughter. Promise me you'll see the world. Promise me you'll live." A promise Naomi was failing every single day. "I have a proposal for you," Harold said then, his voice lowering, almost conspiratorial. "Something that could change your life." Naomi looked up, unsettled by the resolve in his gaze. "What kind of proposal?" Before he could answer, the door swung open. Another nurse stepped in, breathless, informing Naomi she was needed in the emergency room immediately. "A traffic accident," Multiple victims. Naomi rose on instinct, professionalism snapping into place. We'll talk later, Mr. Sterling. Yes, Harold said, squeezing her hand once more. We will, but remember, this sometimes, salvation comes disguised as madness. Don't be afraid to grab it when it appears. Naomi nodded, not fully understanding, and rushed back into the corridor. She couldn't have known that in less than 2 weeks. She would be forced to make a decision that would challenge everything she believed about herself, or that this dying old man would become the architect of a transformation that would alter her life forever. That night, as Naomi stitched wounds and comforted grieving families, she wasn't thinking about the future. She was thinking only about surviving. Another shift, another day, another voicemail from a creditor she would pretend not to hear. She didn't see. Harold Sterling watching her through the glass of his door, an enigmatic smile touching his dry lips. He had a plan. A plan involving his fortune, his troubled grandson, and a wary nurse who didn't yet realize she carried the key to mending something broken decades ago. At 6:15 a.m., when Naomi finally found a moment to check her phone, she saw 17 missed voicemails, all creditors, all demands she couldn't meet. The last message was different. An eviction notice, 30 days. That's all she had. Naomi locked herself inside the staff bathroom, slid down against the cold tile, and for the first time in months, she cried. Her sobs echoed softly off the walls, swallowed by the running faucet she'd turned on for privacy. What would she do? Where would she go? And while tears streamed down her exhausted face, somewhere across the city, a man named Zion Sterling was receiving a call informing him that his grandfather's condition had worsened and that he needed to come immediately for a conversation about the will. Fate was already moving to lives completely different, completely unprepared, were about to collide. The conference room on the top floor of Sterling Dynamics overlooked the Atlanta skyline like a throne room made of glass and steel. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, a controlled panorama of power and ambition. Everything in the room minimalist furniture in charcoal and black. The precisely calibrated temperature. The quiet hum of embedded technology had been designed to convey dominance, restraint, and control. That was exactly how Zion Sterling liked it. At 38 years old, Zion had transformed his grandfather's once modest firm into a multi-billion-dollar tech empire. His face appeared on magazine covers. His name was spoken in boardrooms with a mix of admiration and fear. Investors competed for minutes of his time. Rivals studied his moves like battlefield strategies. Employees learned quickly that mistakes were not forgiven, they were eliminated. Yet that Thursday morning, seated in his Italian leather chair, Zion wasn't thinking about acquisitions, mergers, or hostile takeovers. His attention was locked on the phone in his hand. Hospital call. Your grandfather requests your presence immediately. Family matter. Family matter. The phrase tasted bitter. Zion hadn't known what family truly meant for most of his life. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 5. Rensselaer roads. A misjudged curve, a moment that erased everything. One instant, he had been a child in the back seat. The next, he was alone in the world. Harold Sterling had raised him, yes, but from a distance. Always working. Always building, always chasing the next deal. The company flourished, but the boy did not. Zion learned early that tears solved nothing, that emotions weakened judgment, and that the only thing he could rely on was himself and the power money provided. Mr. Sterling, the voice of his assistant, Tanya Brooks, interrupted his thoughts. Your meeting with the Tokyo investors starts in 15 minutes. Cancel it. Tanya blinked. Sir, they flew in from Japan specifically. I said, cancel it. Zion's tone left no room for discussion. I have a personal matter. In 8 years of working for him, Tanya had never heard those words from his mouth. Should I reschedule? When I get back, he stood, buttoning his tailored suit with precise, efficient movements. And Tanya, don't call me, unless the building is on fire. Literally. The drive to the hospital passed in silence inside his black Maserati. Zion never listened to music while driving. He considered it unnecessary noise. The low growl of the engine and the rhythm of his thoughts were more than enough. Despite everything, Harold Sterling was the only person alive who could still reach him. Maybe it was gratitude, maybe obligation, or maybe it was something deeper Zion refused to examine too closely. When he'd received the cancer diagnosis 6 months earlier, he'd felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. Fear. Fear of losing the last, fragile anchor in his life. When Zion entered Grady Memorial Hospital, heads turned immediately. Nurses whispered, patients stared. People moved aside instinctively, as if he carried an invisible gravity that demanded space. He ignored it all, his focus locked on one destination. Room 412. He pushed the door open and stopped. His grandfather wasn't alone. Beside the bed, adjusting the pillows with careful, almost maternal gentleness, stood a woman in a nurse's uniform. Her dark hair was pulled into a loose, messy bun. When she turned at the sound of the door, Zion noticed the exhaustion etched into her face and the depth in her eyes, brown eyes, warm, heavy with responsibility. For the briefest fraction of a second, so fast he later convinced himself it hadn't happened at all, something shifted in his chest. A flicker of curiosity, recognition, interest. He shut it down immediately. Zion, Harold said, sounding stronger than expected. Come in, come in. The old man gestured toward the woman. This is Naomi Pierce, my favorite nurse. Naomi, this is my grandson, the famous CEO who has time to run an empire but not to visit a dying old man. The veiled criticism landed cleanly. Zion ignored it. His gaze met Naomi's and held. Most people looked away from him within seconds. She didn't. Mr. Sterling, Naomi said, dipping her head politely. I'll leave you two alone. No, Harold said, closing his hand around hers. You stay. This conversation involves both of you. Naomi frowned, clearly confused. Zion felt the same confusion, though his face remained carefully unreadable. Grandfather, what are you talking about? Sit down, Harold ordered. Both of you sit. It wasn't a request. Zion pulled a chair closer, maintaining deliberate distance from Naomi as she sat on the opposite side of the bed. Their eyes crossed briefly over Harold's frail body, and in that instant, neither understood they were standing on the edge of something far bigger than either of them. Harold looked from one to the other, a spark of youth flashing in his tired eyes. You're probably wondering why I brought you together. The answer is simple. I'm about to interfere in your lives in a way you'll hate at first. Naomi opened her mouth to speak, but Harold raised a hand. Let me finish. He turned to Zion. You know I'm a wealthy man. Very wealthy. And you're my only heir. Zion didn't react. But there's a condition for you to receive your inheritance, Harold continued. A condition that involves the young woman sitting beside you. The silence that followed was thick enough to press against Naomi's chest. She glanced at Zion, expecting surprise. His face remained carved from stone, though his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. What kind of condition? Zion asked, his voice pure ice. Harold smiled. Not kindly, knowingly. One that will force you to become human again. My grandson, whether you want to or not. He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a yellowed envelope, extending it toward Zion. Read it. Then decide. Zion took the envelope and opened it. As he scanned the page, Naomi saw something she never expected to see on the face of one of the most feared men in American business. Genuine disbelief. His hands that signed contracts worth millions without trembling shook, almost imperceptibly. When he finally lifted his gaze and looked straight at her, the intensity of it stole the air from her lungs. In that moment, Naomi knew her life was about to change completely. The only question was whether it would be for better or for worse. The words on the paper refused to settle in Zion Sterling's mind. They blurred, rearranged themselves, demanded logic where logic did not exist. He read the letter once. Then again. By the third time, his jaw tightened, and the faint tremor in his hands became impossible to ignore. This is a joke, he said at last, his voice slicing through the silence like a blade. A tasteless joke. Harold Sterling met his gaze without blinking. Do I look like I'm joking? Zion scoffed softly, disbelief edging into anger. You've known me for 33 years. Have you ever seen me joke about money? Naomi sat frozen in her chair, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure both men could hear it. She didn't understand what was happening, but she felt herself being pulled into something she hadn't agreed to. Can I know what that paper says? She asked, hating how small and unsteady her voice sounded. Zion looked at her, as if he'd forgotten she was there. For a fleeting moment, something cracked in his expression: vulnerability. Raw and unguarded before the mask slid back into place. Without a word, he tossed the paper into her lap. Read it yourself, he said coldly. Apparently, my grandfather has decided we're pieces in his private chess game. Naomi's hands shook as she picked up the document. It was handwritten. The elegant script unmistakably Harold's. Harold Sterling, being of sound mind, declare the following conditions for the transfer of my inheritance. Naomi swallowed and kept reading. My grandson, Zion Sterling, will inherit my estate, valued at approximately $200 million, only if he enters into matrimony with Naomi Pierce within 30 days of my passing. Her breath caught. The couple must reside together in my private residence for a minimum period of 6 months, completing daily household tasks that will be monitored by security cameras. Naomi's heart hammered harder with every line. To Ms. Naomi Pierce, regardless of the outcome, the sum of $500,000 will be guaranteed, deposited into a bank account of her choosing, along with the settlement of all existing debts. $500,000. Should Zion Sterling refuse to comply, the inheritance will be donated in its entirety to preselected charitable organizations. This declaration is final and irrevocable. Naomi read the letter 3 times, each pass leaving her more unsteady than the last. All her debts erased. The eviction notice, burning inside her bag, suddenly felt less immediate, less suffocating. Marriage. To a stranger. A stranger who, at that very moment, looked at her like she'd invaded his life, because in every practical sense, she had. Mr. Sterling, Naomi said carefully, turning to Harold. Why me? We barely know each other. I'm just your nurse. Just my nurse, Harold repeated, a faint smile touching his lips. In recent weeks, you've shown me more kindness than my own blood ever has. You listened when I needed to talk. You held my hand when I was afraid. And not once did you treat me like a burden or a bank account. He turned to Zion, his expression sharpening. And you, my grandson, need to learn what I failed to teach you. That life is more than numbers and acquisitions. That control and power mean nothing without connection. Zion let out a bitter laugh. So your solution is to force me into an arranged marriage, like we're living in the 19th century. My solution, Harold replied evenly, is to give you a chance to discover that there's still a heart beating beneath all that ice. He coughed, the effort visibly draining him. Do you think I don't know how you live? Alone in that sterile penthouse, 16-hour workdays, no friends, no relationships, nothing that gives meaning beyond accumulating more zeros. My life is none of your business, Zion snapped. Yes, it is, Harold shot back. Because I helped create this monster. His voice wavered, and Naomi saw tears gather in the old man's eyes. When your parents died, I promised I'd take care of you. But I was too busy building an empire to notice I was raising an empty fortress. This is my last gift to you, Zion, the chance to be human again. The room filled with decades of unspoken words, of love withheld and grief ignored. Naomi felt like an intruder in something deeply personal. She shifted as if to stand, but Harold caught her hand. Stay, he said softly. You have a choice to make, too. He looked straight into her eyes. You have 30 days before you lose your apartment. You work yourself past exhaustion, and still can't touch the interest on your debt. How much longer do you think your body can take this? Each word struck like a blow. I'm offering you a way out, Harold continued. Not the way you dreamed of, but a way. $500,000. All your debts paid. 6 months of stability. All I ask is that you try to humanize my grandson. I'm not a charity case, Zion growled. No, Harold replied calmly. You're worse. You're a rescue mission. He closed his eyes briefly. Spent, you both have 48 hours to decide. Naomi stood automatically, nurse instincts taking over. She checked Harold's vitals, adjusted his medication, and made sure he was comfortable before stepping out. Zion was already waiting in the hallway. You're not seriously considering this, he said the moment the door closed. It wasn't a question, Naomi replied, meeting his gaze fully for the first time. Tall, broad-shouldered, sharp jaw, green eyes carved from ice. Handsome in a way that felt almost dangerous and completely closed off. Why wouldn't you? She asked quietly. Zion hesitated. Because it's absurd. Because you'd be forced to live with a stranger. He paused. Because I'm not easy to live with, I noticed, Naomi said. Something that almost resembled a smile crossed his face before disappearing. Naomi thought of the creditors, the eviction notice, the promise she'd made her mother. I'll think about it, she said. 48 hours, right? She started down the corridor, but his voice stopped her. If you accept, Zion said tightly, this will be a contract. Nothing more. Naomi turned back. If I accept, I won't expect anything from you. The last man I trusted left me with $300,000 in debt and a broken heart. She walked away without looking back, leaving Zion alone with thoughts he couldn't control and a feeling. In his chest, he refused to name 40-8 hours. Everything was about to change. The next 48 hours crawled by with a cruelty Naomi Pierce had never experienced before. Time stretched and bent, each minute heavier than the last, as if the universe itself wanted to make her suffer through every second of indecision. At the hospital, Naomi moved on autopilot. Her hands performed familiar routines, checking vitals, administering medication, comforting patients, while her mind replayed the same impossible question over and over again. Every ringing phone made her stomach tighten. Every vibration in her pocket reminded her of the 17 voicemails she hadn't returned. The creditors didn't stop calling. She simply stopped answering. By the end of her shift on the second night, exhaustion clung to her bones like damp cold. When she finally returned to her apartment, the small, cramped space she would lose in less than a month, Naomi didn't turn on the lights. She dropped her bag near the door and sank onto the living room floor, surrounded by silence. One by one, she pulled out every bill she owned, student loans, medical invoices from her mother's treatment, the loan guarantee she'd signed for Richard, the man who once promised her a future and disappeared the moment it collapsed, $300,000. The number stared back at her like a sentence she could never escape. Even if she worked until her body failed, even if she sacrificed every ounce of her youth, she would never be free. On the other side of the scale sat a single figure, $500,000. Freedom. A reset. A chance to breathe. Again, the cost was 6 months. Pretending to be married to a man made of stone. Naomi picked up the only framed photograph in the apartment. Her mother's 50th birthday, Rose Pierce, smiling wide, unaware of the diagnosis that would steal her life months later. What would you do, Mum? Naomi whispered. What would you tell me? The apartment offered no answer, but in the quiet, Naomi remembered her mother's voice, gentle, steady, unbreakable. Sometimes, my daughter, life pushes us onto paths we never planned to walk. The secret isn't avoiding them. It's finding the courage to take the first step. The next morning, Naomi entered room 412 with a resolve she hadn't felt in years. Harold Sterling was awake, watching the door as if he'd been waiting. Sitting stiffly in a chair beside him was Zion Sterling, shoulders tense, expression unreadable. I came to give my answer, Naomi said, her voice firm despite the pounding of her heart. Me too, Zion said. Without looking at her, Harold's gaze moved between them slowly, knowingly. Then say it at the same time. Naomi and Zion looked at each other. For one suspended second, something passed between them, recognition, fear, understanding. The silent agreement that once they spoke, There would be no turning back. I accept, they said together. A smile spread across Harold's face, victory, mixed with relief. Excellent. Simply excellent. There are conditions, Zion said immediately, his negotiation instincts snapping into place. Separate bedrooms. No physical contact beyond what's required for appearances. After 6 months, we go our separate ways. I agree, Naomi said, without hesitation. And I add one thing, I keep my independence. I continue working. I'm not your employee. I never thought you were, Zion replied. Harold chuckled weakly. You two already sound married. He coughed, the effort draining him. The ceremony will be in 3 days. 3 days. Naomi's eyes widened. That's my lawyers will handle everything, Harold said. You just show up, sign the papers, and begin. The next 3 days passed in a blur, documents, signatures, decisions. Naomi barely had time to process. At Harold's insistence, Naomi took paid leave from the hospital for the duration of the arrangement. She packed her entire life into 3 battered suitcases, trying not to think about what she was leaving, or what she was walking into. The wedding took place at the most discreet courthouse in Atlanta. No guests. No flowers. No music. Just Naomi, Zion, Harold in a wheelchair. To witnesses who had been paid not to care. When the official asked Naomi if she accepted Zion Sterling as her husband, she looked at the man beside her. Impeccable suit, perfect posture. Eyes fixed straight ahead. I do, she said. The words felt strange. Hollow. I do. Zion echoed seconds later. Just as detached, when the rings were unadorned bands, chosen by Zion's assistant, their fingers brushed. Electricity shot through Naomi's arm. Zion stiffened at the same moment. Neither of them commented. You may kiss, the official said. An awkward pause followed. A kiss on the cheek will do, Harold interjected. Clearly enjoying their discomfort, Zion leaned in and pressed a brief, careful kiss to Naomi's cheek. His lips were warm, softer than she expected. When he pulled back, something in the air had shifted. Welcome to married life, Harold said, smiling. Now go home and try not to burn the place down. The car rolled through wrought iron gates an hour later, revealing the Sterling estate. Naomi's breath caught. Stone and glass rose before her like something unreal. Surrounded by manicured gardens and gleaming water, it didn't look like a house. It looked like another world. Is this a home or a country? She murmured. Zion didn't answer, but she could have sworn she saw the corner of his mouth twitch. The front door opened before they reached it. A golden retriever barreled toward them.
Hey.
Naomi barely had time to react before the dog jumped up, licking her face enthusiastically. Zeus, Zion barked. Down. The dog ignored him completely. Naomi laughed real laughter. The first in weeks. He was my grandfather's, Zion muttered. Clearly has poor taste. Naomi scratched Zeus behind the ears. Or excellent taste. Zeus wagged his tail furiously. And for the first time since signing her name to a contract that changed everything, Naomi felt something unexpected. Hope. What she didn't see was Zion, watching her from the corner of his eye, watching her laugh, watching something stir inside him that had been dormant for years. This was just a contract, that's what he told himself, again and again. The first week of living together unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. The Sterling mansion was large enough to make disappearance easy. Naomi stayed in the East Wing. Zion claimed the West. Entire days passed without more than the faint echo of footsteps reminding them the other existed. Naomi woke early, her body still tied to hospital rhythms. Zion worked late into the night, sealed inside his home office, as if the walls themselves were an extension of his armor. She brewed coffee in the kitchen. Each morning, he had it delivered to his desk by the housekeeper. They spoke only when necessary, and even then, only in clipped, functional exchanges. The only moments they were forced into the same space were during the household tasks Harold had mandated in his will. Discrete cameras installed throughout the mansion ensured compliance. Silent witnesses to an arrangement neither of them had chosen freely. The first task appeared on a printed card left on the kitchen counter. Cook dinner together. Lasagna. Naomi stared at the card for a long moment before letting out a slow breath. Of course, she had been in the kitchen for nearly 20 minutes. Reviewing the recipe left by the housekeeper, when Zion finally entered, he wore tailored dress pants and a linen shirt, as if casual clothing simply didn't exist in his world. "You're late," Naomi said, without looking up. "I was on a call with Tokyo," Zion replied coolly. "The time difference isn't convenient for domestic obligations." "Well, you're here now," she said, pointing to a cabinet. "Grab that pan." Zion followed her gesture, staring at the cabinet with visible uncertainty. "Which one?" "The large one." "For lasagna." She finally looked at him and froze. Genuine confusion stared back at her. "You've never cooked before, have you?" she asked. "I have people for that." "Of course you do." What followed was chaos in its purest form. Zion didn't know how to mince garlic. He confused boiling with soy. At one point, he poured olive oil into a pan so hot it burst into flame. The fire was small and quickly extinguished. But not before the smoke detectors screamed and the security system automatically alerted. Emergency services. Minutes later, firefighters flooded the kitchen. They found Naomi leaning against the counter, laughing so hard, tears streamed down her face, while Zion's face smudged with soot tried to explain that everything was under control. "Mr. Sterling," one of the firefighters said, clearly recognizing him and struggling to suppress a grin, "you might want to consider cooking lessons." When the firefighters finally left, the kitchen looked like a war zone. Burned pasta, ruined sauce, tomatoes splattered across the floor. Naomi and Zion stood in the middle of it, staring at the wreckage. "You've got sauce in your hair," Zion said. Naomi touched her head and grimaced. "And you've got soot on your nose. You look like a Dalmatian." Something shifted. Zion laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't polished. It slipped out of him before he could stop it. Low, hesitant, real. The sound transformed his face, stripping away years of control. Naomi felt something loosen in her chest. "Frozen pizza," she offered. "Frozen pizza," he agreed. They ate, sitting on the kitchen floor, backs against the cabinets, sharing a single pizza Zion discovered, buried in the freezer. Zeus lay between them, stealing pepperoni whenever he could. "My grandfather planned this," Zion said suddenly, glancing at the cameras. "He knew I'd be useless in a kitchen." "He's still alive," Naomi said softly. "Maybe we should visit him tomorrow." Zion was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe." That night, Naomi lay awake in the enormous bed in the East Wing, thinking about Zion's laugh, how different he looked when his defenses cracked. Across the mansion, Zion stared at his ceiling, replaying the day. Naomi's laughter, her ease, the way she treated him like a person, not a billionaire. This was just a contract, that's what he told himself. But the thought didn't feel as convincing as it once had. It was during the second week that the nights began to change. Everything. Naomi Pierce had never been a good sleeper. Years of rotating hospital shifts had ruined any natural rhythm her body might once have known. But inside the Sterling mansion, the sleeplessness felt different, heavier, more restless. The silence at night was too complete, too vast, pressing in on her thoughts in a way the constant noise of the city never had. On the first night it happened, Naomi gave up on sleep at a little after 2 in the morning. She slipped out of bed and made her way downstairs, barefoot, expecting the kitchen to be empty and quiet. It wasn. Single quotes. TDOA Stoning sat at the kitchen table. The lights off, his profile lit only by moonlight streaming through the tall windows. A bottle of whiskey rested in front of him, already half empty. He didn't hear her at first. "Can't sleep?" Naomi asked softly. Zion turned sharply, caught off guard. For a fraction of a second, before the familiar walls snapped back into place, she saw something raw in his eyes. Something that looked a lot like pain. "I never do," he said finally. "My mind doesn't shut off." Naomi hesitated at the doorway. Every instinct told her to retreat, to give him space. Instead, something stronger pulled her forward. She crossed the room and sat down across from him. She didn't ask questions. She didn't offer advice. She didn't judge, she just stayed. The silence between them felt different from before, less tense, almost safe. As if the darkness stripped away the need for masks. "My parents died when I was 5, Zion said suddenly, the words spilling out as if they'd been waiting. "Car accident, rain, bad curve. You know the story." Naomi nodded, staying quiet. "What people don't know," he continued, his hands tightening around the glass, "is that I was in the back seat. I saw everything. I waited there for hours with their bodies in front of me." Naomi's chest tightened painfully. "You don't have to. I don't know why I'm telling you this," Zion said, finally looking at her. In that moment, she didn't see the billionaire. She saw a frightened child still trapped inside him. "I never tell anyone." "Maybe," Naomi said gently, "because it's easier to be honest at 2 in the morning." He studied her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. "Maybe." The second night, the roles reversed. Naomi sat in the garden beneath an old tree, hugging her knees, tears slipping silently down her face. The weight of debt, the exhaustion, the loneliness she'd carried for so long, it all collapsed at once. Zion appeared quietly, a blanket draped over his arm. Without a word, he placed it around her shoulders and sat beside her. "Why are you awake?" she whispered, wiping her eyes. "I heard you leave," he said. The realization struck her harder than she expected. "You don't have to do this," Naomi murmured. "Take care of me. It's not part of the contract." "I'm not doing it for the contract," Zion replied. The words lingered between them. Heavy with meaning, neither of them dared to touch. On the third night, Naomi stayed in her room, exhausted and emotionally drained. At 3 in the morning, there was a soft knock at her door. Zion stood there, holding 2 cups of tea. His hair was mussed, his tie gone, his shirt replaced by a worn t-shirt that made him look disarmingly human. "I thought you might need company," he said, almost embarrassed. She should have said no. Should have remembered the rules. Instead, she stepped aside. "Come in." They talked until dawn. Zion spoke of boarding schools, loneliness, and building walls so thick he forgot who he'd been before them. Naomi told him about her mother, about nursing instead of medical school, about Richard, the man who promised everything and left her buried in debt. When sunlight finally touched the room, Zion had fallen asleep in the chair. Naomi covered him with a blanket, watching his face soften without its armor. When he awoke, her fingers were intertwined with his. From that night on, the midnight visits became a ritual. Unspoken, necessary, and slowly, the walls they'd built began to crumble. The third week brought with it a task neither of them expected, one that would shift everything they thought they understood about each other. Among the obligations, outlined in Harold Sterling's will, was the organization of the mansion's attic. It was a space that hadn't been touched in decades, sealed off like a forgotten chapter of the house's history. Boxes, furniture, and memories slept beneath layers of dust and silence. Naomi approached the task the same way she approached everything else in her life. With calm efficiency and quiet determination, she rolled up her sleeves, tied her hair back, and began sorting through the clutter methodically. Zion followed her up the narrow attic stairs with visible reluctance. Manual labor was clearly not his natural habitat. He limited himself to carrying boxes and doing exactly what Naomi instructed. No more, no less. "This feels like an abandoned museum," Naomi said, brushing away a curtain of cobwebs. "When was the last time anyone came up here?" "Probably before I was born," Zion replied, his gaze scanning the space without much interest. "My grandfather always said these were remnants of another life." They worked in relative silence, the air thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Naomi moved furniture aside, opened trunks filled with mothball-scented clothing, and sorted through forgotten objects until something caught her eye. A small wooden box sat tucked behind a stack of crates. It was darker than the others, polished, intentionally preserved. The initials HS were carved neatly into the lid. Zion, Naomi said, her pulse quickening. Look at this. He approached, frowning slightly. Then lifted the lid without hesitation. Inside were dozens of photographs, their edges yellowed with age. Letters folded carefully, and beneath them, something that made Naomi's breath stop, a VHS tape. Written in fading ink across the label were the words, Garden, Summer 1990. Is there a VCR somewhere in this house? Naomi asked, her instincts screaming that this mattered. It took 20 minutes of searching before they found an old television and a working player, tucked into a forgotten corner of the attic. Zion connected the cables in silence, his movements tense. When the screen flickered to life, the image was grainy, shaky, clearly home footage. The garden appeared first. The Sterling estate. Decades younger, but unmistakable. Then laughter filled the room. 2 children ran across the lawn, a little girl, about 5 years old, with brown hair pulled into crooked pigtails. A boy, no more than 3, with bright green eyes and unsteady steps. Naomi's chest tightened. Zion, she whispered, unable to finish the sentence. He stood completely still, his face draining of color as the video continued. The girl stopped and turned toward the boy. Zion, come here. Look what I found. The little boy toddled toward her arms, swinging clumsily. She held up a small yellow flower like it was a treasure. It's beautiful, the boy said. It's for you, the girl replied. Because you're my best friend. The child's voice, her own voice, rang through the attic. The boy accepted the flower carefully, eyes wide. When we grow up, he said, I'm going to marry you. The girl laughed. Promise. Promise. The video continued for a few more moments, 2 children chasing each other through sunlight. But Naomi and Zion couldn't move. I remember this, Naomi said finally, tears spilling freely now. My mother worked here as a housekeeper. She used to bring me when she had no one to leave me with. Zion swallowed hard. Why don't I remember? His voice was tight, restrained. Why don't I remember you? She thought of the accident. The trauma. The years his mind had spent protecting itself. You were 3, Naomi said softly. And then, everything happened. Zion straightened abruptly, fists clenched. My grandfather kept this. All these years. He knew. Understanding crashed into Naomi like a wave. This wasn't random, she whispered. I wasn't a coincidence. No, Zion said hoarsely. You never were. He turned to her, and for the first time, his defenses were completely gone. There was pain in his eyes, but also recognition. Something older than memory. You promised me a flower, he said quietly. Naomi laughed through her tears. And you promised me a wedding? Silence filled the attic. Sacred, Bernard hadn't manipulated them. He had reunited them that night. When Zion appeared at Naomi's door, he didn't bring tea or excuses. He held a single yellow flower in his hand. Freshly picked from the garden. I should have given you this 35 years ago, he said. Naomi took it, her hands trembling. It's never too late. And somewhere, in a quiet hospital room, Harold Sterling smiled. The 4th week began with separation. Zion had to fly to Los Angeles for an urgent merger, one of those high-stakes deals that refused to wait. No matter how much the rest of life demanded attention, what was supposed to be a short, 3-day trip carried a strange weight neither of them wanted to acknowledge. It'll be quick, Zion said that morning, adjusting his jacket as the driver loaded his suitcase into the trunk. 3 days. Maybe less. Naomi nodded, pretending the tightness in her chest didn't exist. Zeus will survive without you. The golden retriever, sitting loyally at her feet, barked once in agreement, clearly taking sides. That dog hates me, Zion muttered. He doesn't hate you, Naomi replied, scratching Zeus behind the ears. He just prefers better company. Zion opened his mouth to argue, but the driver cleared his throat softly. Time, I'll call when I land, Zion said. You don't have to, Naomi answered. I know, he said. But I will, and he did. The first call came at 9 in the morning, barely an hour after landing. Did Zeus eat? Zion asked, sounding oddly serious. Sometimes he refuses new food. Naomi glanced at the dog, sprawled contentedly on the rug after finishing every last bite of breakfast. He ate everything. Oh, good. A pause. Talk later. The second call came before noon. The irrigation system, do you know how it works? Zion, Naomi sighed, amused. You have professional gardeners, I know, but what if they forget? Gardeners don't forget to water gardens. Silence. You're right, he said. Sorry. By evening, the calls had become impossible to ignore. Weather updates. House checks. Security questions. By the seventh call, Naomi laughed openly. If you call again to ask whether I know how to breathe, I'm hanging up. There was a pause on the other end. I was going to ask if you need anything from Los Angeles, Zion said quietly. There are stores, Zion, Naomi said softly. Why are you calling so much? This silence was different, heavier, unguarded. Because distance is making me realize things, he admitted. Things about us, about what this has become. Naomi closed her eyes. Her heart raced. What kind of things? The kind I wasn't supposed to feel, he said. This was never part of the plan. Neither of them spoke for a moment. It's getting complicated, Zion added, and I don't know how to handle complicated. I don't either, Naomi said honestly. Another silence, but this one felt warm. Shared, sleep well, Zion finally said. You too. That night, at 11. The phone rang again. The house feels wrong without you, Zion confessed, his voice lower than before. Naomi lay in bed, Zeus curled at her feet. Wrong how? Like something's missing, he exhaled. Someone, her chest tightened. I feel it too. I can't sleep without our midnight talks, he admitted, without showing up at your door with ridiculous excuses. She smiled softly. Your excuses were terrible. One time you said you heard a noise, she teased. It was Zeus, snoring. It could have been an intruder with breathing problems. She laughed out loud. When are you coming back? She asked quietly. The final meeting is tomorrow night, Zion said. I could stay for the celebration dinner, or I could cancel it and drive back tonight. You can't cancel a business dinner. I can do whatever I want. A pause. Do you want me to come back sooner? Naomi thought of every reason she should say. No, this was just a contract. This wasn't real. This couldn't last. Then she thought of the yellow flower in the vase beside her bed. Yes, she whispered. I want you to come back. Zion arrived the next morning at 6:30. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes, stubble shadowing his jaw. In his hands was a ridiculously large bag. What's that? Naomi asked, standing barefoot in the doorway, hair still tangled with sleep. Chocolate truffles, Zion said simply. You mentioned once that you liked them. She stared at the bag. That's a lot of truffles. I stopped in Chicago. Chicago isn't on the way from Los Angeles. I know. They stared at each other. Naomi stood on her toes and kissed his cheek quick. Impulsive, unplanned. Zion froze. His hand rose slowly to touch the spot she'd kissed, like he needed proof it had happened. Thank you, she whispered. Taking the bag. You're welcome, he said, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard before. That morning, they had breakfast together, side by side. No distance. No excuses. And when their eyes met across the table, both of them knew this was no longer pretend. That night, Zion didn't knock on Naomi's bedroom door, he simply opened it. Naomi sat on the edge of the bed with a book open in her lap. Though she hadn't turned a page in minutes, when she looked up and saw him standing there, she didn't ask why. She didn't pretend surprise. She just shifted slightly, making space beside her. Zion sat down slowly, his shoulders tense, the exhaustion from the drive still clinging to him, but there was something else there too. Something restless, uncontained. I can't pretend anymore, he said, staring straight ahead instead of at her. That this is just a contract. Naomi closed the book and set it aside. Neither can I. The words hovered between them, heavy with everything they'd been avoiding. Zion finally turned to her. For the first time since she'd known him, he didn't hide what he was feeling. His hand rose hesitantly, as if unsure he was allowed, and gently cupped her cheek. His touch was warm, careful, reverent, sending a quiet fire through her skin. "Naomi," he said, his voice rough, thick with emotion. "Don't talk," she whispered, covering his hand with hers. "Just stay." That night, for the first time, they slept together. They didn't undress in urgency. They didn't rush. Naomi curled into Zion's arms, her head against his chest, his breath warm against her hair. Their bodies fit together naturally, their hearts finding a shared rhythm in the dark. They didn't do anything more than sleep, and yet, it was the most intimate thing Naomi had ever known. More intimate than the relationships she once mistook for love. More real than the promises Richard had made and broken. This was quiet, vulnerable, terrifying. When morning light filtered through the curtains, Naomi opened her eyes to find Zion already awake, watching her. "How long have you been awake?" she murmured, her voice still heavy with sleep. "A while." "Doing what?" "Looking at you." She flushed. "That's a little creepy, I know." He didn't look away. "You make noises when you sleep," he added thoughtfully. "I do not." "You do," he insisted. Little sighs, he searched for the word. "They're adorable." Naomi laughed and buried her face in the pillow. The great Zion Sterling, using the word adorable. "Your shareholders would panic. They'd know I'm human," he said dryly. "It would ruin my reputation." She lifted her head and saw the smile on his face, real, open, unguarded. In that moment, he wasn't the untouchable CEO or the feared billionaire. He was just a man. "What happens now?" Naomi asked softly. Zion was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing slow, absent patterns along her arm. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've never done this before." "Done what?" "Let myself feel something real," he said. "Something that makes me want more." Naomi propped herself on one elbow and looked at him. "Are you saying you feel something for me?" "I'm saying I can't imagine my life without you in it," he replied. "And that terrifies me." She watched him carefully. "Why?" "Because I don't know how to be someone another person can love." Naomi smiled softly and leaned closer. "You already are. Every time you show up at my door in the middle of the night, every time you drive across states for chocolate truffles, every time you let your walls down." "What if that's not enough?" he asked quietly. "What if it is?" The question hung between them, alive with possibility. Zion brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Of hurting you. Of hurting myself. Of discovering this is just an illusion." "I'm scared too," Naomi said, covering his hand with hers. "But fear means we have something worth protecting." He let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You're willing to risk this?" "Knowing I'm difficult?" Naomi laughed. "Zion, I signed a marriage contract with a stranger to pay off my debts. Risk clearly isn't my weakness." He smiled at that, then leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I want to see where this goes." Later that morning, they ate breakfast together, holding hands across the table. Zeus watched them with canine approval, tail thumping softly against the floor. And somewhere, in a quiet hospital room, Harold Sterling smiled into his pillow, knowing his plan had finally worked, but the story wasn't finished yet. The greatest tests and the greatest truths were still ahead. A week after the words had finally been spoken aloud, the notary arrived at the mansion. His name was Robert Vasquez, a man in his early 60s with gold-rimmed glasses and the composed demeanor of someone accustomed to carrying other people's secrets. Naomi and Zion received him in the living room, seated side by side on the sofa, closeness that had quietly become natural. "I have specific instructions from Mr. Harold Sterling," Robert said, opening a leather folder with deliberate care. These documents were to be delivered only when certain conditions were met. Zion's hand tightened around Naomi's instinctively. "What conditions?" The notary glanced at them, his knowing smile subtle. "I was told I would know when the time was right. Apparently, this is it." He extended a sealed envelope, the wax stamp unbroken despite the years it had waited. Zion accepted it with hands that betrayed a rare nervousness. Naomi leaned closer as he broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Harold's handwriting was unmistakable, firm, the script of a man who had spent a lifetime signing decisions that shaped destinies. My dear grandson, if you're reading this, it means my plan worked. Zion swallowed hard. It means you looked at Naomi not as an obligation, but as the extraordinary woman she is. It means you finally lowered the walls you built around yourself. Naomi's breath caught. I must confess something. The will was a lie. There were never any conditions on your inheritance. You were always my only heir. Everything I own would have been yours, married or not. Zion stiffened, emotion flickering across his face. Before your anger rises, let me explain. I watched you become an empty fortress. I watched a frightened 5-year-old grow into a man who believed control was the only form of safety. I watched you push everyone away, including me. Naomi squeezed Zion's hand. Emily, no. Naomi was coincidence that became destiny. When she came into my life as my nurse, I felt something familiar. It took time, and an old tape from 1990, to understand why. Zion closed his eyes briefly. You promised her something when you were 3 years old, my boy, and promises, even childish ones, carry power. The letter continued. The money I left Naomi is real. She earned it through exhaustion, sacrifice, and kindness she never asked to be rewarded for. The clinic is real too, a place for those the system forgets. Naomi felt tears slip down her cheeks, but the real gift was the two of you. Naomi will teach you how to be human again, and you will give her the security no money ever could, the certainty of being chosen. If I'm wrong, then forgive me. But I don't believe I am. Some debts are paid with money. The most important ones are paid with courage. Be brave. Be happy. Harold's silence settled heavily over the room. Zion stared at the letter, tears openly falling, now unhidden, unashamed. Naomi turned toward him fully. He didn't manipulate us, she said softly. He saved us. Zion laughed quietly, the sound breaking. He could have just introduced us like normal people. And would you have noticed me? She asked gently. He shook his head. No. The notary cleared his throat. There's one more envelope. This one is for Mrs. Sterling. Naomi accepted it with trembling fingers. Inside was a simple letter and an old key. Dear Naomi, the building downtown is yours. Make it the clinic you always dreamed of. Care for those who are forgotten, the way you cared for me. The key opens the winter garden. My wife Lucy and I shared tea there every afternoon. I couldn't bring myself to enter it again after she left. Fill it with life. Thank you for giving my grandson back to himself. Naomi looked up at Zion through tears. We have a garden to open. And a life to build, he replied. Later that afternoon, the key turned in the winter garden's lock with a soft creak that echoed years of silence. Dusty glass panes filtered sunlight onto wicker furniture and a tea table set for two. Frozen in time. It's beautiful, Naomi whispered. Zion took her hand. This is where I want our future to grow. He knelt, then right there among dust and memories. I promised to marry you once as a child. Then again for the wrong reasons. Now, I'm asking for the right ones. Naomi dropped to her knees, laughing through tears. Yes. Always yes. When they kissed, the winter garden seemed to breathe again, and somewhere beyond walls and time, Harold Sterling finally rested, knowing love had finished what he began.